young woman once crossed a line no one dared approach. Elara, a cartographer with ink-stained fingers and a relentless heart, chose to defy centuries of fear. Her village elders had forbidden any travel into the northern wastes, a land shrouded in terrifying legends of great drakes. But Elara believed those stories were hiding a deeper truth, and she was determined to be the one to map it. She risked everything for this quest, her exile and her very life, all for the chance to prove that the unknown was not something to be feared, but understood. By the end of her journey, you will discover how a single map can rewrite history and forge an alliance between worlds. What secrets lay buried in the ice and stone that her people were too afraid to seek? And what happens when the monsters in the legends turn out to be something else entirely? I'm curious if it feels right to share. Where are you listening from right now? And what is the local time where you are? Do you believe some truths are worth any risk to uncover? The crunch of gravel under her boot was the only sound as Elara stepped past the lichen-crusted boundary stone. This was it. The air itself felt different here, thinner and sharp with the scent of iron and old frost. Her training took over, her hands moving almost independently as they sketched the jagged peaks and deep ravines onto her vellum. Every step was a calculated risk, testing the ground for hidden fissures and unstable slopes of scree. She was a cartographer, and this was her act of creation, drawing the lines of a world everyone else had chosen to forget. But back in the village, her empty cot and missing gear would have been discovered by now. Shouts of alarm would be turning into plans, and the very elders who forbade this journey would be organizing a party to drag her back. The weight of that pursuit felt heavier than her pack. Was this all a terrible mistake? A reckless gamble built on the whispers of old tales? Her breath plumed in the freezing air as she pushed the doubt down. She had crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Her resolve hardened just as her eyes fell upon the ground ahead, and she froze. There, pressed deep into the permafrost, was a track. It was wider than her outstretched arms, with 3 long, cruel talon marks scoring the earth. This was no bear, no trick of the ice. This was proof. The legends were real. She pressed onward, driven by a feverish mix of fear and triumph, the path leading her deeper into the heart of the wastes. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the ice in shades of blood and violet, a low, resonant rumble echoed from the mouth of a nearby canyon. It was a sound that promised the tracks were only the beginning. The rumble guided her feet, a deep vibration in the stone that pulled Elara toward the canyon's mouth. She moved with a hunter's silence, every sense straining against the twilight, and then she saw them. The canyon walls soared upward, and they were not blank stone. They were a tapestry of impossible history, carved with such scale and detail that her breath caught in her throat. Great winged shapes, their forms weathered by centuries of wind, but still unmistakably draconic, coiled across the rock. They soared over the spires of a magnificent city, its architecture unlike anything built by human hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was not just evidence of beasts, it was the chronicle of a kingdom. Here was the proof she had gambled her life for, yet its sheer grandeur was humbling. It spoke of a civilization so advanced, so powerful, that her own people's existence felt like a brief footnote. She traced a gloved finger over the outline of a dragon in flight, her mind racing to decipher the story. Were these carvings a record of glory or a warning? Every shadow now seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes, and the memory of those colossal tracks sent a fresh chill down her spine. The sensible choice was to retreat, to find shelter elsewhere. But the carvings held a silent, gravitational pull. To leave now would be to abandon the greatest discovery of her age at the first sign of fear. She made her decision. As full darkness fell, she built a small, shielded fire in a deep crevice, its flickering light dancing across the ancient scenes. Her quest had transformed in a single afternoon. It was no longer just about mapping a forbidden land. It was about finding that lost city and uncovering why a people of such majesty had vanished from the world. The fate of her own village felt small against this new, monumental goal. She was so absorbed in her notes, trying to match the carved city's landmarks to the surrounding peaks, that she almost missed it. A glint of reflected firelight, sharp and black as polished glass, shifted high up on the canyon rim. It was not stone, it was scale. Her breath stopped in her lungs. The great head that lowered from the shadows was not that of a mindless beast. It was a creature of obsidian scale and subtle grace, far smaller than the tracks had suggested, perhaps no older than she was. Its eyes, like pools of molten gold, held a sharp, inquisitive light as they scanned her face, her pack, and the fire-lit carvings. Every instinct screamed at Elara to reach for the knife at her belt, to brandish a torch, to do anything the old stories demanded in the face of a dragon. But the stories spoke of roaring monsters and scorching fire, not this silent, calculating observation. The creature tilted its head, a gesture so familiarly intelligent that it shattered the foundation of her fear. It was not a monster, it was a person. Her hand, trembling slightly, moved slowly to her pack, not for a weapon, but for a small pouch of dried apple. She held the piece out on her open palm, a ridiculous offering to a being that could likely swallow her whole. The drake sniffed the air, then, with a delicacy that belied its sharp teeth, it took the fruit from her hand. The tension did not break, it simply transformed. The immediate threat to her life was gone, replaced by a far more complex and terrifying prospect, the need to communicate. The drake finished the morsel, and then, instead of leaving, nudged its snout against the vellum map, still lying open beside her. It tapped a specific point with a single, curved claw, a location deep within the mountain range she had yet to chart. Then, with a powerful beat of its wings that stirred the dust of ages from the canyon floor, it launched itself into the night sky and was gone. Elara was left alone, her heart pounding not with terror, but with a staggering, world-altering hope. The map was no longer just her quest, it was an invitation. The claw's mark on her vellum was not a random point, it was a destination. As the first light of dawn painted the peaks, Elara oriented her map and saw the path the drake had laid out for her. It was a language of stone, not words. A row of towering spires, worn smooth by wind, stood like sentinels. A great arch of natural rock bridged a chasm ahead. These were not random acts of geology, they were markers. Each one guided her away from the sheer cliffs and deep, unstable ice fields she had planned to cross, leading her along a safer, almost hidden route. Could she truly trust this silent guidance, The Elder's warnings of draconic cunning echoed in her mind. Was this intelligent cruelty, luring her into a place where she would be cornered? Or was it a genuine offer of aid from a being who saw her not as prey, but as a guest? Her rational mind screamed caution, but the memory of those intelligent golden eyes overruled it. She chose to follow the map of stone, a decision made on a feeling deeper than logic. Her entire quest, her very survival, now depended on this fragile, wordless pact. To misread the signs would mean a lonely death in the ice, her story ending as just another cautionary tale. The path descended steadily, and the biting wind began to soften. A new scent reached her, thick and organic, the smell of damp earth and living things. She pushed through a narrow pass between two colossal boulders, and the world transformed. Before her lay a hidden valley, shrouded in gentle steam. Warmth radiated from the ground, melting the snow to reveal patches of hardy moss and strange, luminescent fungi. This was no wasteland, it was a sanctuary, a pocket of life sustained by the earth's own fire. The drake had not led her to a trap, but to a refuge. Her breath caught as she took it in, the sheer improbability of it silencing her doubts. At the far end of the valley, a deep fissure in the earth vented plumes of steam into the air, and from within that fissure, a low, resonant humming vibrated through the soles of her boots. The humming grew into a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in her very bones. Elara crept closer to the steam-veiled fissure, her movements slow and deliberate as she peered over the edge. The sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. Far below, nestled in the heart of the mountain, lay a cavern of impossible scale. Warmth radiated from its walls, and the entire chamber was bathed in a soft, pulsating light that emanated from towering crystalline structures. They grew from the floor and ceiling like a forest of living gemstones, their gentle glow syncing with the cavern's rhythmic hum, and among them moved the drakes. They were not a mindless horde, younger, smaller drakes, their scales still bright and unblemished, darted and tumbled in playful chases around the crystal's bases. Larger adults moved with a deliberate grace, using claws and the heat of their breath to gently tend to the crystalline forms, clearing away mineral deposits or guiding the growth of new facets. This was not a lair, it was a sanctuary, a thriving community. The crystals were not mere rocks, they were conduits, drawing the mountain's geothermal heart into a stable, usable energy. The drakes were not its conquerors, they were its gardeners, living in a perfect, ancient symbiosis with the land her people had dismissed as a dead and frozen waste. Elara pressed herself against a rocky outcrop, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. To be seen now would be catastrophic. A single cry of alarm could turn this serene society into a furious, defensive swarm. The larger adults, their horns scarred and their eyes holding the weight of centuries, moved with a vigilant air, their heads occasionally lifting to scent the air. She was an intruder here, a foreign speck in their sacred home. Every instinct told her to flee, to take this secret and run, but her cartographer's soul rebelled. To leave without a record would be a greater crime. She slowly, silently, pulled her journal and a piece of charcoal from her pack. She would not be a thief or a conqueror. She would be a witness. Her hand flew across the page, sketching the curve of a crystal, the elegant arch of a drake's wing, the careful, nurturing touch of a guardian. Each line she drew was a bridge, a fragile attempt at understanding. The fate of two peoples now balanced on the point of her charcoal stick, on her choice to observe and not to interfere. The stakes were no longer just her life, but the potential for a peace, or a war, that would echo for generations. Her focus was so complete that she did not notice the loose shale beneath her boot. Her shift in weight was slight, but it was enough. A single stone broke free, clattering down the cavern wall in a series of sharp, echoing reports. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, every head in the cavern turned. And the largest of the elder drakes, its golden eyes narrowing, fixed its gaze directly upon her. The world seemed to shrink to the space between her and the elder drake's golden eyes. Time stretched thin as the great creature, whom she would come to know as Ignis, moved toward her. There was no roar, no blast of fire, only the slow, deliberate placement of each scaled foot. He lowered his massive head until they were nearly eye to eye, his breath a warm, mineral-scented wind that stirred the pages of her open journal. Elara stood frozen, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, every instinct screaming to run. But she saw no malice in that ancient gaze, only a deep, probing intelligence, a question being asked without words. Then the images began to bloom in her mind. They were not her own memories. She saw the spires of the city from the canyon carvings, but now they were alive, gleaming under a brilliant sun. Humans and drakes moved together, not as masters and servants, but as partners. A human hand rested on a drake's flank, guiding the shaping of a crystal spire. A drake offered its wing as a bridge across a chasm. The feeling was one of profound unity, a shared purpose that resonated through the mental link like a forgotten song. But the vision shifted. She saw the first sparks of human greed, the desire not to share the land's energy, but to own it, to control it. She saw fear twist noble faces into masks of suspicion. The partnership fractured. The final image was a searing memory of betrayal, of humans leading a hidden army to the very heart of this sanctuary, not to talk, but to conquer. The mental connection broke, leaving Elara gasping, the bitter taste of that ancient treachery coating her own tongue. Her terror was now tangled with a crushing shame. She was not just an intruder. She was a descendant of the very people who had shattered this world. How could she possibly prove she was different? Words were useless here. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the leather strap on her pack. She pulled out her main map, the one that held her entire journey, her dreams, her proof. It was her most precious possession, the sum of her life's work. Holding her breath, she stepped forward and slowly, deliberately, unrolled the vellum on the ground before Ignis. It was a surrender, but not of her life. It was a surrender of her knowledge, her perspective. She was offering her world to him, as he had just offered his to her. The cavern was utterly silent, every drake watching. Ignis' great head tilted, his molten eyes scanning the inked lines, the marked peaks and valleys. He saw her village, the boundary stone, the path she had taken. He saw her world, laid bare. For a long, agonizing moment, he was still. Then a low, thoughtful rumble echoed from his chest. He lifted his head and let out a resonant call, a sound that was neither a threat nor a roar, but a clear summons that vibrated through the crystalline air. From all corners of the cavern, other drakes, young and old, began to gather, their forms converging on the central clearing, where the largest crystals pulsed with a soft, steady light. Elara's single, vulnerable moment of offering was over, and the judgment of an entire people was about to begin. The circle of elders was a living mosaic of scale and stone. Drakes of every size and hue, their hides patterned by age and the elements, formed a silent, judging ring around Elara. Ignis stood slightly apart, a calm anchor in the storm of their unspoken debate. Then the thoughts began to flow, not as clear images this time, but as sharp, overlapping currents of emotion and intent. She felt the hard, cold wall of fear from a massive elder with scales like cracked granite. His mind showed only fire and the fall of ancient spires, a history of human betrayal that demanded a swift, decisive answer to her intrusion. She was a threat to be eliminated. Another, her scales the color of mossy copper, projected a wave of cautious curiosity. She felt the elder's probing interest in the strange, inked skin Elara had laid upon the ground, the map. This one, like Ignis, saw not just a human, but a singular event, an anomaly that warranted study. The political structure of the Drakes was laid bare in that psychic chorus. They were not a monolithic hive, but a council of clans, each elder representing a different region of the wastes, and they were deeply, dangerously divided. Her life hung in the balance of an argument she could only feel, not hear. To remain silent was to be a subject for debate, an object. She had to become a participant. Her voice was a fragile thing against the weight of their presence. She knelt, placing a finger on her map, on the location of her village. Then she traced a path with her other hand to the hidden valley where they now stood. She did not speak of peace or friendship. Those were concepts too grand and too stained by history. She spoke their language, the language of the land. She pointed to a narrow pass her people called the Serpent's Back, a place her maps marked as treacherous and useless. But from the perspective of a flying creature, she now realized it was a perfect, defensible vantage point, a place to watch without being seen. Then she indicated a high plateau rich with iron deposits, a resource her village craved but could never safely mine. For the Drakes, whose claws could shape stone, it was a place to grow the strongest of their crystalline structures. She was not offering an alliance. She was offering a cartographer's insight, pointing out geographical facts that could benefit both their peoples, suggesting neutral grounds where needs did not have to become conflicts. The granite-scaled elder let out a low, dismissive rumble, a psychic shove of pure rejection. The risk was too great, the pattern of history too clear. But the moss-colored drake tilted its head, its gaze fixed on the iron-rich plateau Elara had indicated. The internal conflict of the Drakes was a perfect mirror of the fear that ruled her own village elders, a cycle of suspicion that threatened to repeat its tragic end. Just as the tension in the cavern reached its peak, a shadow fell across the entrance. A younger drake, its sides heaving from exertion, landed in a flurry of snow and wind. It fixed its eyes on Ignis and let out a series of sharp, chuffing sounds. A ripple of alarm passed through the assembled elders. Elara did not need a psychic link to understand the message. The village search party was no longer a distant worry. They had crossed into the wastes, and they were closing in. The news of Captain Boren and his armed search party hit Elara like a physical blow. Her own people, the very community she had hoped to enlighten, were now the greatest threat to the fragile peace she had just brokered. Captain Boren was not a cruel man, but he was stern and unyielding, a man who saw the world in stark lines of safety and danger. To him, the wastes were danger, and her rescue was a mission to reclaim order. He would see the Drakes not as a civilization, but as the monsters from the legends, a threat to be met with steel and fire. The delicate understanding she had forged in the cavern, the silent exchange of maps and meanings, would shatter the moment his scouts saw a winged shadow. A single misread gesture, one arrow loosed in fear, would ignite a war that would consume both her village and this hidden sanctuary. Her loyalty was a rope stretched to its breaking point, pulled taut between the home she loved and the truth she had sworn to uncover. She could not let them fight. Turning to the circle of elders, her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. She asked for a chance, not as a cartographer or an emissary, but as a daughter of her village. She would go to Boren alone, without the intimidating presence of a Drake, and make him see. She would stand in that frozen no-man's land between two worlds and try to turn back the tide of fear with nothing but her own conviction. It was a desperate gamble. Boren might simply arrest her and press onward, making her a prisoner in her own rescue. Or worse, the Drakes might see her departure as a betrayal, a return to the humans who had betrayed them long ago. Ignis studied her, his molten eyes reading the conflict on her face. He understood the weight of her request, the immense risk she was taking for a chance at peace. His agreement came not as a spoken word, but as a low, resonant hum of assent. Yet trust, once broken, is not so easily restored. As Elara gathered her pack, a younger Drake, sleek and silver-scaled, alighted beside her. This was Lyra, swift as a mountain gust and fiercely observant. She would not interfere, Ignis conveyed, but she would watch from the high air, a silent guardian and a living witness. If the humans harmed Elara, the Drakes would know. Her solitary journey back was now a performance for two audiences, the armed men on the ground and the keen eyes in the sky, with the fate of two peoples resting on her ability to bridge an age of silence. The crunch of fresh snow under heavy boots signaled their arrival long before Elara saw their faces. Captain Boren stood at the very edge of the boundary stone, his expression carved from the same granite as the peaks behind him. His eyes, sharp and weary, scanned her from head to toe, searching for injury or madness. She stood her ground, her journal held out before her like a shield. "I am unharmed, Captain," she said, her voice clear in the thin air, "and I bring proof. The Drakes are not monsters, they are a people." Boren's gaze barely flickered to the open pages, filled with sketches of crystalline structures and elegant, scaled forms. He dismissed them with a grunt. Fanciful drawings born of exhaustion and cold, he stated, his voice leaving no room for debate. "Your duty is to your village, Elara. This quest ends now. You will return with us and put these foolish notions from your head." The finality in his tone was a door slamming shut on everything she had learned. To obey was to condemn both their peoples to a future of fear and potential war. To defy him was to sever her last tie to home. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the weight of his authority. She took a slow, steadying breath, her eyes locking with his, Then I cannot obey that order, Captain. The words hung in the frozen air, absolute and irreversible. A ripple of shock went through the men behind Borin. I will not be the cause of a battle that could have been prevented, Elara continued, her voice gaining strength. If you will not listen, then I will stand as an ambassador, whether you acknowledge me or not. My place is here now. Borin's face hardened into a mask of grim resolve. You are an outcast, then, by your own choice. He turned to his men, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Prepare to advance. We retrieve our lost citizen and clear this land of the threat that clouds her mind. As the armed party tightened their grips on their weapons and stepped past the boundary stone, the air itself seemed to fracture. From high above, a piercing cry tore through the silence, a sound of pure, resonant alarm that was neither bird nor beast. Every head snapped upward. There, circling against the stark white sky, was the silver-scaled drake, her warning call echoing across the wastes. The drakes were not hiding. They were watching. The sky itself seemed to tear open as the flight of drakes crested the peaks. Ignis led them, a living storm of scale and wing that blotted out the pale sun, not with roaring fury, but with a silent, overwhelming presence that stole the very breath from the men below. Swords and bows, which moments before had felt like instruments of order, now seemed like toys in their trembling hands. Captain Borin stood rigid, his face a pale mask of shattered certainty. The advance he had ordered frozen mid-step by the sheer scale of the power arrayed against him. In that charged silence, Elara moved. She did not run toward her people or plead with the drakes. She walked directly into the empty, windswept space between them, a solitary figure in a vast landscape, and raised her empty hands high to the sky. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the slow, powerful beat of the great wings above. Every instinct in the armed men screamed to pull her back, to protect her from the monsters. Every instinct in the drakes, hardened by ancestral memory, saw a human standing defiantly before their leader. A single shouted command, one nervous archer loosing his arrow, one drake misreading a gesture as a threat, and the fragile chance for peace would die in a storm of fire and steel. And she would be the first to fall. The world held its breath. Then, with a grace that belied his immense size, Ignis descended. The wind from his wings whipped snow into a stinging cloud as he landed before her, the ground shuddering under his weight. His molten gold eyes met hers, and in them she saw not the mindless beast of legend, but the ancient elder from the cavern. This was the moment. It had to be a gesture beyond language, an act so unequivocal it could bridge the chasm of fear. Slowly, never breaking eye contact, Elara took one final step forward. She reached out her still trembling hand, and Ignis, in a move of profound and deliberate trust, lowered his colossal head. Her bare palm met the warm, textured plane of his scaled brow. It was not a submission, nor a dominance. It was a greeting, a recognition, a silent treaty made flesh in the simple, impossible contact between human skin and dragon scale. That single touch sent a tremor through the very air. A collective gasp rippled through the line of hunters, their weapons lowering in stunned disbelief. From the hovering drakes came a low, harmonic hum of astonishment. The impossible had happened right before their eyes, and the foundations of their world shifted. Then Ignis raised his head, his golden eyes glowing with an intense inner light, and the vision bloomed in the minds of everyone present. It was not a memory of fire and war, but of creation. They saw the first humans of the North, not as conquerors, but as lost and freezing survivors, welcomed by the drakes into the warmth of the geothermal valleys. Together, they learned to channel the mountain's energy through the crystals, building the great city whose ruins Elara had found. It was a pact of shared stewardship, a promise etched not on parchment, but in the very stone they shaped together. The betrayal that followed was a sharp, painful sting, but it was now framed not as the inherent nature of humanity, but as a tragic fracture in a long-forgotten partnership. The propaganda that had fueled generations of fear in the village shattered like thin ice. Captain Boren's stern face was a landscape of conflict, the old stories warring with this new, profound truth. His shoulders, once squared for a fight, slumped in a quiet surrender. He raised a hand, his voice raw with emotion. "Stand down, all of you, stand down." The order was not just for his men, but for the centuries of hatred they carried. He looked from Elara to Ignis, his authority now tempered by a newfound humility. He would return to the village, he told them. He would carry Elara's maps and this impossible story to the council, though he knew they would call him mad. The immediate danger had passed, but the true battle was only beginning. The deep-seated prejudice in his own village and the justified suspicion lingering among the drakes were walls far stronger than any mountain pass. As Boren and his chastened men turned back toward home, Elara made her choice. Her place was no longer within the village walls, bound by their limited sight. Her work was here, in the vast, silent library of the wastes, with the one who remembered the old songs of the earth. She would remain with Ignis, not as a prisoner or a guest, but as the first student and first teacher in a new age. The fate of two worlds now rested on the most fragile of foundations, the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust, one honest conversation at a time. The new meeting ground was a windswept valley, far from the drake's sanctuary and her village's border. Here, under the vast, open sky, Elara and Ignis began the slow, painstaking work of building a common tongue. She would point to a stone and speak its human name, her voice thin against the wind. Ignis would respond with a low, complex rumble that seemed to vibrate from the earth itself, a sound she learned to feel in her chest as much as hear with her ears. In turn, she unrolled her maps, tracing the lines that represented rivers and mountains, teaching him the human symbols for distance and danger. He showed her how the drakes saw the world not in flat lines, but in layers of thermal currents and mineral deposits, a living geography her paper could never fully capture. This exchange was more than a lesson. It was the first stone laid in a foundation of trust. Each shared word, a small defiance of the silence that had ruled for generations. But that defiance came at a cost. Back in her village, the name Elara was no longer whispered with pity, but spat with the venom of traitor. Captain Boren's account of the drakes was dismissed as the ravings of a man spellbound by a heretic. The elders declared her an outcast in full, her life's work tainted by her association with the monsters of the wastes. On the other side of the peaks, Ignis faced his own quiet council of dissent. A faction of elders, led by the granite-scaled drake from the cavern, viewed his patience as a dangerous weakness. To them, teaching a human their ways was not diplomacy. It was arming the enemy with their most sacred knowledge. Every meeting in the valley was an act of faith that strained their loyalty to their own people. It was this pressure that forged Elara's next great ambition. A simple truce would never be enough to mend such a deep fracture. They needed proof, something tangible that both sides could see and touch. She proposed a new map, one that would not chart a single people's domain, but a shared land. This would be no ordinary cartographer's work. It would be a massive stone tablet, carved with the precision of a human map, but etched with the flowing, glyph-like script of the drakes. It would show the hidden geothermal valleys as places of life, not danger, and mark the human villages not as threats, but as neighbors. The success of this collaborative project became the fragile hope upon which everything rested. If they could create it, it would be a weapon against fear, a silent, unarguable testament to what was possible. The first strikes of her chisel against the slate were quiet, but they echoed with the weight of two worlds. Their work did not go unnoticed. One evening, as Elara struggled to translate a human symbol for a safe mountain pass into a durable engraving, a shadow fell over the half-finished stone. It was not Ignis. A clan of smaller drakes, no larger than wolves, had gathered at the valley's edge. Their scales shimmered with 1,000 flecks of embedded crystal, and their claws were fine and delicate. They were artisans, masters of shaping stone and growing crystal with a precision the larger drakes could not match. They watched her clumsy attempts with keen, intelligent eyes, not with judgment, but with a craftsman's curiosity. One, its hide a tapestry of obsidian and amethyst, stepped forward. It did not look at her, but at the flawed carving, and let out a soft, chiming rumble that was both a question and an offer. The artisan drakes did not wait for an invitation. With a series of soft, chiming clicks, the obsidian and amethyst leader approached the stone slab, its delicate claws tracing the rough lines of Elara's carving. It was a critique and a proposal, all in one silent gesture. The great work was no longer just Elara's burden or Ignis' hope. It was now a shared creation. These master carvers saw in her human precision a skill they lacked, just as she saw in their innate artistry a power she could only dream of. Together, they designed a monument far grander than a simple tablet, a towering stone pillar that would stand at the crossroads of their worlds. Its four faces would tell a story, the shared history Ignis had shown the hunters, the true geography of the wastes, and a promise for the future written in both human script and draconic glyph. This pillar would be a permanent, unignorable answer to the fear-mongers on both sides, but a symbol is only as strong as the effort behind it, and the effort immediately tested their fragile alliance. The sheer weight of the chosen stone required a team of the largest drakes to haul it into place, their powerful wings stirring up gales that scattered Elara's carefully sorted parchments. The human workers, who arrived with Boren's cautious blessing, flinched at every shift of scale and shadow, their hands trembling too much to hold a charcoal stick steady. The drakes, accustomed to working with the heat of their breath and the strength of their claws, grew frustrated with the slow, deliberate pace of human measurement and planning. It was chaos, a cacophony of misunderstanding that threatened to crack the pillar before it was even raised. Elara stood in the middle of it all, her voice growing hoarse from translating not just words, but intentions. She had to become a foreman of peace. She organized the first true mixed work groups, assigning tasks by innate strength, The drakes lifted and shaped the massive stone blocks, their fiery breath perfect for smoothing rough edges to a glassy finish. The humans took charge of the detailed layout, using their fine motor skills to sketch the intricate maps and glyphs directly onto the stone before the carving began. It was a practical solution, but every day was a public test. A single drop tool could be misinterpreted as an attack, a moment of draconic impatience seen as a return to monstrous instinct. The hardliners in both camps watched from a distance, waiting for a single failure to prove their warnings right. Yet, as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. The shared labor began to build its own kind of trust, one that was stronger than words. A young human apprentice, fascinated, offered a water skin to a drake whose breath had grown dry from hours of carving. The drake, in a gesture of startling gentleness, used the very tip of its claw to etch a tiny, perfect flower beside the human's sketched border, a silent thank you. The pillar began to rise, a beautiful, strange hybrid of human geometry and draconic fluidity, and as it grew, its presence became a beacon. From the lower valleys, where other, isolated human settlements had survived in fearful isolation, came the first wary scouts. They watched from distant ridges, seeing not a monster's lair or a fool's errand, but the impossible rising silhouette of a collaboration that challenged everything they thought they knew. The arrival of the scouts was an unending tide of suspicion and wonder. They came from isolated villages tucked deep in the lower valleys, their faces etched with the same deep-seated fear that had once ruled Elara's own people. Some watched the rising stone pillar with a cautious, dawning hope, drawn by whispers of a woman who spoke with dragons. Others, especially the hard-eyed miners from the settlement of Stonehand, saw only a threat to their claims on the region's iron and crystal deposits. They did not come with open hands, but with weapons prominently displayed, their distrust a palpable force in the thin mountain air. Elara's world, once defined by the solitary work of a cartographer, had irrevocably shifted. She was now a diplomat, her every word and gesture scrutinized by a dozen different factions, each with their own history of loss and survival. The miners' leader, a broad-shouldered woman named Kaelin, made their position brutally clear. She stood before the half-finished monument, her gaze sweeping over the collaborating drakes and humans with open contempt. "Your alliance blocks our path to the Iron Spire peaks," she stated, her voice cold and flat. "Our village survives on what we pull from the earth. We will not be starved by your fantasy of peace." The fragile truce, so carefully built between Elara's home and Ignis clan, now teetered on the edge of much wider conflict. One spark of violence from Stonehand could ignite a war that would consume the entire northern wastes. That evening, as the sun set the snow ablaze in crimson, Elara and Ignis met in the shadow of their shared creation. The psychic link between them hummed with shared understanding. They could not fight this new threat with force, nor could they plead with words that would be dismissed as lies. They had to change the very foundation of the argument. The decision was made not in words, but in a moment of silent resolve. They would call a summit. They would invite representatives, not just from Stonehand, but from every human settlement in the region, to stand here at this monument and bear witness. It was a colossal risk. Gathering so many conflicting interests in one place was an invitation for chaos. a single stage upon which the entire piece could shatter. Yet the alternative, to let suspicion fester and spread, was a certain, slower death for their dream. The stakes were no longer about one village or one clan of drakes, but about the future of the entire northern region. As preparations began, Elara watched the wary scouts from her own people trying to explain the pillars' carvings to the newcomers. The words were not enough. She realized with a sinking certainty that a shared history, even one carved in stone, would not convince people whose bellies were empty and whose forges were cold. To win over the skeptics, they needed more than a symbol. They needed a miracle. They needed to show them, in a way that could not be denied, that this alliance was not a threat to their survival, but the key to a prosperity they had never dared to imagine. The solution did not come from words, but from a single, perfect object. One of the obsidian-scaled artisans approached Kaelin, the mining leader, and placed a small, rough stone in her calloused palm. It was unremarkable, a dull gray geode. With a gentle tap of its claw, the drake cracked the stone open. The interior was not filled with simple crystals, but with a pulsating, warm light that bathed Kaelin's face in a soft, steady glow. This was the secret the drakes had nurtured for centuries. The very crystals they tended in their sanctuary were not just for their own use. They were vessels, capable of storing the Earth's geothermal heart and releasing it as clean, lasting warmth and light. For human settlements shivering through the long, dark winters, reliant on smoky fires that choked the air and demanded constant fuel, this was not a symbol, it was a revolution. The argument for peace shifted in an instant from abstract morality to a matter of sheer, practical survival. Kaelin's eyes widened, not with wonder, but with a sharp, calculating greed. She closed her fist around the glowing halves. "So you have hoarded this," she accused, her voice cutting through the gathered crowd. "You have sat on a power that could have saved countless lives, and now you dangle it before us like a prize. We will not barter for what is rightfully the wealth of this land. Hand over the knowledge of how to grow and harvest these crystals." Now, the air grew taut. This was the old fear, the human demand for control, repeating itself, but Ignis did not roar in defiance. He stepped forward, his voice a low rumble that resonated in their bones. He did not offer the technology as a gift, nor would he allow it to be taken as plunder. Instead, he proposed a trade, a pact of mutual need. The geothermal vents that fed the crystals were not infinite fountains, he explained. They were living, breathing systems deep within the mountain, and they were growing unstable. A vent known as the Earth's Fury was the most volatile, its energy surging in dangerous, unpredictable waves that threatened to shatter the entire network. The drakes alone could not calm it. They needed help. He offered to teach humans how to safely use the crystals in exchange for their assistance. They would work together to monitor the vents, to build structures that could channel and stabilize the raging energy. It was a profound shift. Peace was no longer a hopeful idea. It was an economic and practical necessity. The survival of the drake's energy source now depended on human labor, and the comfort and safety of the human villages now depended on draconic knowledge. Their fates were to be deliberately, inextricably woven together. Kaelin was silent for a long time, the glowing geode heavy in her hand. She saw the trap, the brilliant, inescapable trap of interdependence. Her people's pride warred with their profound need. Finally, she gave a short, sharp nod, "We will consider your terms," she conceded, "but words and glowing rocks are not proof. If you speak true about this partnership, then we will test it at the source. We will run your trial at the Earth's fury itself." The journey to the Earth's fury was a trek into a living nightmare. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur, and the ground trembled with a constant, ominous growl. Before them, the vent was not a simple hole in the ground, but a gaping wound in the mountain, spewing superheated steam and hurling shards of molten rock into the sky. It was a raw display of nature's power, and the predicted eruption would have indeed scoured the nearby hamlet from the map. There was no more time for debate. The mixed team swung into action with a choreography born of desperate necessity. The drakes, their scales shimmering with heat, flew directly into the chaotic updrafts, using their bodies to shield the humans from falling debris as they positioned the massive, resonant stabilizing crystals around the vent's rim. On the ground, the miners from Stonehand, their earlier suspicion replaced by a focused urgency, used their ropes and pulleys to anchor the heavy crystals, their engineering creating a secure lattice that held the drake's work firm. For a few tense hours, it seemed their bold plan would work. The vent's roar began to soften into a low, managed hum. Then came a sound that had nothing to do with the mountain, a sharp, sickening crack of shearing rock. A section of the cliff face, weakened by the constant vibrations, broke away and crashed down, sealing a narrow ledge and trapping 3 miners alongside a young, silver-scaled drake who had been securing a final crystal. In an instant, the mission to tame the earth became a race to save lives. Elara did not hesitate. She scrambled over the still shifting rubble, a miner named Rorik at her side. Inside the dusty, dark pocket of air, the young drake was frantically trying to dig its way out, its claws scraping uselessly against an immovable slab of granite. Elara placed a steadying hand on its flank, while Rorik, his voice calm despite the panic in his eyes, assessed their prison. "We work together or we die here," he stated, not as a plea, but as a simple fact. He directed the drake to use its concentrated breath to heat and weaken a specific point in the rock, while he and Elara used a mining pick as a lever, their combined human strength prying at the fractured stone. Outside, Ignis coordinated a different kind of effort. Larger drakes used their powerful shoulders to brace the remaining cliff face, preventing another collapse, while other miners worked with them, directing their strength to carefully lift the larger boulders. It was no longer a human rescue or a drake rescue. It was a single, unified effort. When the final rock was shifted and the trapped group stumbled out, coughing and covered in dust, the feeling that swept through the team was more profound than any celebration. It was a quiet, unshakable respect, forged in shared peril and sealed by mutual salvation. The news did not just travel, it exploded across the northern wastes. The story was not one of grand speeches or carved symbols, but of a miner sharing his water with a scorched drake, of a dragon's wing shielding a human from a rockfall, and of a hamlet that would never know how close it came to destruction. Public opinion, once a wall of suspicion, crumbled overnight, replaced by a fragile but growing belief in a shared future. The alliance was no longer a diplomat's dream. It was a lived and breathing truth. The completed monument stood as a silent witness to the gathering, its 4 carved faces gleaming in the midday sun. It was a sight not seen for 1,000 years, a summit of sun and scale. Representatives from every human village and Drake clan stood on the open ground, a sea of worn leather and shimmering scale, the air thick with the weight of history and the lingering scent of ozone. Old grievances were aired like worn banners. The words of human elders met with low, rumbling counterpoints from the Draconic Council. Yet the memory of the Earth's fury held them together, the shared triumph and the tangible promise of the warm, glowing crystals, creating a fragile but tangible foundation for a new beginning. That foundation was tested immediately. The human miner, a gruff, powerful man named Gruff, slammed a calloused fist onto a map spread across a flat stone. "The Scablands Valley is ours by ancestral right," he growled, his voice rough with conviction. "Our fathers dug its iron, and our sons will too." From the draconic side, the massive elder Vorlag, his scales the color of cooled magma, let out a dismissive snort that sent a plume of smoke into the air. His psychic projection was a wave of pure territorial instinct, an image of the valley as a sacred nesting ground, its mineral veins the very bones of the mountain that his clan was sworn to protect. The argument escalated, voices and rumbles rising in a chaotic chorus. Gruff stepped forward, his hand instinctively going to his pickaxe, while Vorlag lowered his head, a deep, threatening growl building in his chest. The entire peaceful gathering teetered on the edge of violence. In that charged silence, Elara stepped between them. She did not shout. She placed one hand on the map over the contested valley and the other on the monument beside her. She proposed something that had never been considered before. The Scablands would become a jointly managed territory, she declared, her voice clear and carrying. Its resources would be shared equally, its delicate ecosystem protected by a council of both human miners and Drake guardians. It was a radical compromise that asked both sides to relinquish a piece of their sovereignty for the sake of a shared future. The fate of the entire northern wastes hung in the balance, the hope of a new era balanced against the deep-seated instincts of ownership and defense. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, with a sound like grinding stone, Vorlag uncurled a single, formidable claw. He did not look at Gruff, but at the monument that told their shared story. It was a gesture of profound concession. After a heavy pause, Gruff let out a slow breath, the fight draining from his shoulders, and he reached out, his work-roughened hand meeting the offered scale. The agreement was sealed not with a document, but with a handshake that bridged 1,000 years of fear. The first strike of the chisel was a sound that echoed through the new silence of the wastes. Under the patient guidance of the obsidian-scaled artisans, human scribes dipped their tools not in ink, but in molten metal, inlaying the formal terms of the alliance directly into the great stone pillar. This was the final carving, the translation of a handshake into law. The northern wastes were no longer a border to be feared, but a shared territory, its new statutes governing everything from the equitable mining of the Scablands to the mutual defense against any outside threat. It was a constitution written in stone and fire, a promise meant to outlast the lives of those who made it. Yet as the final glyph was set, a strangled cry of pure rage cut through the solemn air. A lone hunter, his face contorted by the old hatred, burst from the crowd and swung a heavy hammer at the pillar's base. He was not a representative of any faction, but a ghost of the past, a man so defined by the legends of monsters that he could not bear to see them erased. The hammer never connected, Captain Borin and 2 of his own men moved with a swift, grim resolve, tackling the hunter and wresting the weapon from his grasp. It was a quiet, brutal moment, but its meaning was louder than any speech. The human community was no longer relying on the drakes to enforce the peace. They were now its guardians, willing to restrain their own to protect the future they had chosen. This single act of self-policing proved the Alliance was more than a symbol. It had become a living authority, its roots sinking deep into the hearts of the people. With the would-be saboteur subdued and the Pact unmarred, a new question settled over the gathering. The map was drawn, the laws were written, but the vast, uncharted wilderness still remained. It was Ignis who turned his great head to Elara, his golden eyes holding a familiar, challenging light. The first task of this new world, he conveyed, would be to truly know it. And so, Elara the Outcast was asked to become Elara the Guide, to lead the first joint cartography guild and chart a future no single people could map alone. The wind tore at her hair as Elara climbed onto the broad, warm plain of Ignis back. This was the final threshold, a leap of faith that went beyond treaties and stone carvings. As his powerful muscles coiled and launched them into the sky, her stomach plummeted, a primal fear of the sheer drop screaming in her veins. She squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the thick scale at the base of his neck. This was not the controlled ascent of a cartographer's imagination. It was a surrender to the raw power of the air itself. Then Ignis' voice resonated not in her ears, but in her mind, a single, calming thought. Breathe, look. She forced her eyes open, and the world she knew dissolved beneath her. The jagged lines of her maps flattened and then transformed into a living, breathing landscape. She saw the thermal currents as shimmering rivers of heat rising from geothermal vents, the very paths the drakes used to soar with minimal effort. The Serpent's Back Pass was not a treacherous line, but a perfect, defensible spine of rock. The mineral deposits her people had fought over were visible as faint, colorful stains on the earth, telling a story of the mountain's ancient heart. This was the true geography, a dynamic tapestry of energy and structure that no ground-bound human could ever fully comprehend. Her vertigo did not vanish, but it was replaced by a soaring, exhilarating understanding. She was seeing the world through his eyes, and it was more beautiful and complex than she had ever dreamed. When they finally descended, her feet touching the solid ground felt alien. She was different. The last barrier, the fear that had separated her human experience from her draconic knowledge, had been burned away in the high, thin air. She was no longer Elara the Outcast, or even Elara the Ambassador. She was simply Elara, a creature of 2 worlds, her perspective forever fused. She immediately set to work, her hands flying across a fresh sheet of vellum. This new map would not just show where things were, but how they lived, charting thermal flows and mineral veins alongside trade routes and safe passes. It was the ultimate expression of their alliance. Just as they turned to begin the journey back, a flash of impossible green caught her eye, a verdant smear of life nestled deep within a ring of impassable, ice-clad peaks. It was a valley completely hidden from the ground, untouched and uncharted. She pointed, her heart leaping with a familiar, insatiable curiosity. Ignis followed her gaze, his own keen eyes narrowing in interest. The work of mapping their shared home was far from over. In fact, The greatest discoveries, it seemed, were only just beginning. The Cartographers Guild was born not in a grand hall, but on the open ground beside the great stone pillar. Its first members a handful of human scholars with ink-stained fingers and young drakes, whose scales still held the bright sheen of youth. Elara stood before them, a woman who had once mapped alone, now architect of a new kind of exploration. Their mission was simple, yet world-altering, to fully chart the shared territories and the vast, unknown lands that lay beyond. This was not a hobby for academics. It was the primary engine for discovery, a living bridge where human precision met draconic perception. On their first expedition, a young scholar named Kalen meticulously sketched a river's winding path, while his drake partner, a swift flyer named Zephyr, scouted from above. Zephyr returned not with a simple course, but with a startling observation. The river vanished into a sinkhole, only to reappear leagues away, its hidden underground flow passing directly through a rich vein of a new, malleable metal. This was the Guild's power in action, a single discovery that solved a water shortage for a human settlement and provided a new material for drake artisans in one stroke. The work was relentlessly dangerous. A sudden blizzard high in the Serpent's Back Pass forced the mixed team to huddle together for warmth, the larger drakes forming a living windbreak with their bodies as the humans used their tools to dig a shared snow cave. In these moments, survival was the only teacher, and the lesson was always the same. Cooperation was not a political ideal. It was the only way to see another sunrise. To cement this partnership into the very fabric of their work, Elara instituted a simple, unbreakable rule. No map, no matter how small, would be considered complete until it was approved and sealed by both a human and a drake senior member. This ensured that every line drawn was a product of two perspectives, that knowledge itself was a shared creation, owned by no single people. The stakes of their success were measured in the warming crystals that now glowed in human longhouses through the winter, and in the stabilized geothermal vents that allowed the drake's own sanctuaries to flourish. The alliance was no longer a fragile idea. It was becoming indispensable, its value proven with every new chart and every solved problem. Emboldened by their triumphs, the Guild now turned its collective gaze toward its most daunting challenge yet, the mysterious, perpetually cloud-shrouded Spire Peaks, a place whispered to be the ancient, primordial homeland of the drakes themselves. The air grew thin and sharp as the expedition climbed, a line of humans and drakes, strung like beads along the sheer face of the Spire Peaks. They moved as one organism, human climbers securing ropes for the younger drakes, whose wings were useless on the vertical rock, while the larger drakes carried supplies and scouted for stable paths from the air. Each gust of wind threatened to tear them from the mountain, and the constant groan of shifting ice was a reminder that the ancient stone itself was their enemy. For the drakes, this was not just a climb, it was a pilgrimage. A deep, resonant sorrow hummed through their psychic presence, a grief for a home lost to time and memory. They pressed on, driven by a need to touch the bones of their own beginning. When they finally crested the final ridge, the wind died to a whisper, and a city of ghosts emerged from the mist. It was not built upon the mountain, but carved from it, its spires and arches flowing like frozen music from the living rock. This was Ethelgard, the first Roost. The silence here was not empty, but heavy with the weight of millennia. The drakes moved through the sprawling ruins with a reverence that bordered on pain, their low rumbles a lament for the glory that had once pulsed through these silent plazas. The expedition's first and most difficult decision was made without a single word of dissent. They would not take, they would only witness. The human cartographers and Drake artisans worked side by side, using charcoals and heat-resistant clays to make impressions of the intricate glyphs covering every surface, creating a perfect record without disturbing a single stone. The knowledge here was a sleeping giant, and to awaken it carelessly could be as dangerous as any physical collapse. The potential was staggering, a library of lost arts that could redefine their understanding of energy, architecture, and even history itself. Hidden deep within the central spire, behind a door that had been sealed by mineral growth for centuries, they found the chamber. It was perfectly circular, and the domed ceiling was a map of the night sky, but a sky from an age long past, depicting constellations no human or Drake now recognized. At its center, a single obsidian plinth held a crystalline disk that seemed to contain a swirling nebula of captured light. This was no simple star chart. It was a clock, counting down to a celestial alignment that had not occurred since the city was young. The swirling light within the celestial disk was not just a map, but a clock. The ancient star chart in the spire peaks held a precise prediction, a rare alignment of stars and moons that the first Drakes had named the Celestial Concordance. Their records suggested this event acted as a cosmic key, resonating with the planet's core and massively amplifying the flow of geothermal energy through the established vent systems. This was the scientific heart of the old myths, a predictable cycle of power that occurred only once every few thousand years. The potential was staggering, a chance to harness a clean, monumental surge of energy that could warm every human settlement and empower every Drake sanctuary for a generation. Yet, the very scale of that power divided the Alliance. The miners of Stonehand, led by Kalen, saw an unprecedented opportunity to fuel forges and illuminate their halls through the deepest winters. They argued for channeling the energy directly, for building great conduits to capture every bit of the celestial gift. But the elder Drakes, especially the cautious Vorath, remembered stories from their own ancestral memories, tales of mountains that had cracked open and lands reshaped when such forces were met with arrogance rather than respect. They feared that tampering could turn a controlled surge into a cataclysm, unraveling the very stability they had worked so hard to build. The argument threatened to shatter the trust the guild had so carefully woven. Elara and Ignis stood between these two poles of ambition and fear. They proposed a third path, one of disciplined curiosity. Instead of trying to harness the concordance, they would observe it. They would use the event as the ultimate test of their shared knowledge, gathering data from the most stable and heavily monitored geothermal vent in the territory. This was not a mission of exploitation, but of understanding, a choice to listen to the mountain before asking it for a favor. The potential reward was a blueprint for safely using a natural phenomenon of epic scale, but the risk was miscalculation, of their instruments failing to warn them of a chain reaction they could not stop. As the predicted date of the concordance drew near, the entire alliance held its breath, its future balanced on the edge of a needle, waiting for the sky to speak. The night of the concordance arrived under a sky of impossible clarity. Every star was a needlepoint of light, and the moons hung like great, luminous pearls in the velvet dark. At the designated geothermal vent, the joint team stood ready, their faces lit by the soft, waiting glow of the observation crystals they had spent months positioning. On a silent signal from Ignis, a flight of drakes launched into the air, their dark forms rising to become sentinels against the star field, their unique senses tuned to the subtle shifts in the energy flows far below. As the celestial bodies slid into their predicted alignment, a deep, resonant hum began to emanate from the earth itself. It was a sound that was felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled up from the soles of their boots and into their very bones. Then the vent erupted, but not with lava or destruction. It was a geyser of pure, brilliant energy, a pillar of shimmering light that pulsed in time with the hum, a beautiful and terrifying display of the planet's raw power. The network of crystals flared to life, drinking in the surging energy and channeling it in controlled streams into the massive, dormant storage crystals arrayed around the site. For a few perfect minutes, it was a symphony of light and coordination. Then a sharp crack, like lightning striking stone, shattered the rhythm. One of the primary storage crystals, unable to handle a sudden, violent fluctuation in the flow, began to glow with an angry, unstable red. Fractures like spider webs bloomed across its surface. If it shattered, the released energy would not only destroy the entire array, but could trigger a chain reaction, destabilizing the vent itself. On the ground, a young human engineer named Anya saw the danger instantly. She shouted coordinates to her partner, a nimble drake named Pyre, who was circling above. There was no time for a psychic link, no time for a committee. Anya's voice cut through the roaring energy, her instructions precise and frantic. Pyre, hearing her, banked sharply and used a focused burst of his breath to heat a specific regulator crystal on the array's far side, a maneuver they had theorized but never tested. At the same moment, Anya and her ground team manually wrestled a series of flow diversion levers, their muscles straining against the incredible force. It was a dance of absolute trust, a perfect sync between a shouted command from the ground and an aerial adjustment from the sky. The angry red glow of the overloaded crystal faded, the fractures ceased their spread, and the harmonious hum of the system restored itself. The crisis had lasted less than a minute, but in that minute, the alliance had been forged anew in fire and necessity. When the last of the concordance energy was safely contained, a profound silence fell, broken only by the shared, exhausted breaths of the team. They had not just observed a celestial event, they had conversed with it, and they had survived the conversation. The stored energy, a tangible, glowing fortune, was distributed as promised. That long winter, human forges in stone and roared with a clean, hot fire they had never known, while the drake sanctuaries basked in a warmth that deepened their crystalline songs. The success proved their union was not merely a political arrangement for a fragile peace, but an engine for unimaginable progress. They had tapped into a rhythm as old as the world itself, and in doing so, they had unlocked a new era of potential for every soul in the northern wastes. The long winter descended with its usual brutal force, but inside the human longhouses, something miraculous happened. For the first time in living memory, the great hearths burned not with smoky wood, but with the steady, clean light of the shared crystals. Children who would have huddled for warmth now played on floors that radiated a gentle, constant heat. In the high roosts, the drakes felt the difference too, their crystalline structures resonating with the amplified energy, filling their sanctuaries with a deep, nurturing warmth that staved off the season's deepest chill. The fear of freezing, a shadow that had haunted both peoples for generations, simply vanished. This was not a theory debated by elders or a promise carved in stone. It was a tangible, life-changing reality. The last pockets of resistance in both camps, those who had clung to the old fears, found their arguments crumbling in the face of warm, well-fed families and thriving draconic young. The alliance was no longer a political experiment. It was the bedrock of their survival. Elara saw this shift not as an endpoint, but as a new beginning. A pact of necessity could last for a season, but a shared culture could last for centuries. She proposed a midwinter festival to be held in the Great Valley where the monument stood. It was a bold gesture, asking two ancient cultures to celebrate together. When the day arrived, the valley was transformed. Human lanterns, crafted from paper and thin hammered metal, hung alongside softly glowing drake-tended crystals, casting a dual light on the snow. The air, once sharp with mistrust, was now rich with the scent of spiced human cider and the smoky, mineral aroma of roasted mountain roots, the drakes favored. Gifts were exchanged, not of great wealth, but of profound meaning. A human woodcarver presented a delicate statue of a drake in flight, carved from a single piece of iron wood. In return, a young drake offered a perfectly smooth, warmth-holding stone it had shaped with its own breath, a personal heating stone for the carver's ailing hands. Stories were shared around the central fire, human tales of stubborn survival, mingling with the low, rumbling psychic histories of the drakes, their narratives weaving together into a single, richer tapestry. The festival was more than a party. It was the living heart of their union, proving that their alliance was not just practical, but joyful. As the celebration reached its peak, laughter and harmonious draconic hum, filling the cold air, a ripple of movement at the valley's edge drew every eye. A figure, slender and cloaked against the cold, moved with an unnerving grace through the gathered crowd. The revelry quieted as the stranger approached Elara and Ignis, bowing deeply before presenting a scroll. The parchment was of a fine, alien make, and it was sealed with a crest of intertwined silver leaves, the mark of the elven kingdoms. A silence fell, deeper and more profound than the winter cold. For generations, the reclusive elves of the southern forests had considered the affairs of humans and drakes beneath their notice. Their sudden interest, arriving here and now, could only mean one thing. The world beyond their mountains had finally taken notice of what they had built, and the quiet isolation of the northern wastes was over. The elf's eyes, the color of ancient glacier ice, held a calculating stillness. He introduced himself as Leron, emissary of the High King of the Silver Woods, and his gaze lingered not on Elara, but on Ignis. His message was a masterwork of formal diplomacy, an invitation to a formal audience, but the unspoken truth hung in the air like frost. They had not sent a messenger for a simple courtesy. The tales of a human woman who rode a dragon and the renewed power of the northern wastes had reached the southern courts, and the ancient, powerful races were no longer content to ignore the frozen north. The isolation that had protected them, and perhaps stifled them, was irrevocably over. Back in the council chamber, carved from living stone, the reaction was a storm of conflicting emotions. The human representatives felt a surge of pride, a validation that their hard-won alliance had earned them a seat at a table they never knew existed. But from the drakes, especially the elder Vorlag, came a low, distrustful rumble. Their ancestral memories held echoes of ancient pacts with the elves, alliances that had soured into cold, centuries-long detachment. The elves were subtle, patient, and their long lives bred a perspective that could be dangerously manipulative. Vorlag's psychic projection was a single, sharp image, an elf hand holding a leash. The fear was clear. Would this journey make them equals, or would they become pawns in a game much older than their own peace? Elara listened to the debate, her own heart a tangle of hope and dread. To refuse the audience would be to declare themselves recluses, potentially making an enemy of a power they could not comprehend. But to accept was to step onto a stage where their simple, hard-earned trust could be twisted by ancient politics and unspoken agendas. She looked at Ignis, and their shared thought was a silent conclusion. Hiding in their mountains was not the action of a true alliance. They had built their peace by facing the unknown together, and this was the greatest unknown yet. They would go south, not as supplicants, but as ambassadors of a new kind of power. The decision elevated their partnership into something with consequences that stretched across the continent. The northern wastes was no longer just a territory. It was a nascent nation, and its stability was now a piece on the geopolitical board. Would they be courted as allies, or would the older kingdoms see their union as a threat to be dismantled? The warmth of their midwinter festival felt a world away as they prepared for the long journey. Elara packed her most detailed maps, while Ignis consulted the eldest drakes for any memory of the southern routes and the political landscape of the elven realms. Their every step would now be watched, their every word analyzed. The simple act of building a future for their people had just become a delicate dance with empires. The road south unspooled like a forgotten thread, leading the small caravan of humans and drakes into lands where spring arrived sooner, and the air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Their progress was a spectacle, a living myth that halted plows in fields and drew hushed crowds to the edges of dusty villages. Elara watched as Ignis, his scales a stark, beautiful darkness against the green hills, would deliberately lower his great head to sniff at an offered flower from a brave child, while the human guards shared their journey bread with wide-eyed locals. They were not just traveling, they were performing the reality of their alliance with every cautious interaction, chipping away at centuries of monstrous legend with simple, silent gestures. Yet not every welcome was curious. In the shadow of the dense wilder wood, they were met by a blockade of woodmen, their faces hard beneath hoods of rough spun wool, their axes gleaming with a promise of violence. These were folk who lived by the old stories, and they saw only a beast from a nightmare, flanked by its human thralls. The air crackled with the threat of drawn steel, and the low, warning rumble from the drakes. A fight here would poison their mission before it even began. Elara stepped forward, her hands empty, and spoke not of peace or friendship, but of geography. She pointed to the treacherous river that bordered the woodmen's lands, a capricious force that flooded their fields in spring and stranded their traders in summer. "We can map it," she offered, her voice clear and practical. "We can show you where the banks are strongest and the currents most predictable." For 3 days, the caravan worked. Human surveyors took measurements from the shore, while drakes scouted from the air, their keen eyes spotting submerged hazards and the subtle tells of unstable ground. Together, they produced a detailed chart of the river's moods. The woodman's leader, a grim-faced man named Elara, studied the vellum, his suspicion warring with the undeniable usefulness of the gift. Finally, he grunted and waved them through, his silence a more powerful endorsement than any cheer. Each such encounter was a stone added to the foundation of their reputation, a small victory that nevertheless carried the weight of their entire future. A single misstep, one moment of draconic impatience or human arrogance, could unravel all the trust they had painstakingly built, turning potential allies into lifelong enemies. The road wound on, and the character of the land began to shift, the wild forests giving way to manicured groves where the very light seemed softer, filtered through leaves of silver and gold. Then one morning, the trees parted. Ahead, rising from a mist-wreathed valley, were the spires of the elven city, their elegant peaks seeming to pierce the low clouds, a place of such immense and ancient beauty that it stole the very breath from their lungs. The polished marble of the elven court felt alien beneath Elara's boots, a surface too perfect for the rugged truth she carried. Before them, seated on a throne that seemed grown from a living tree, was the High King, his ageless face a mask of serene observation. Elara unrolled their maps across a low obsidian table, the vellum detailing not just mountains and rivers, but the shared territories, the jointly managed scablands, and the energy flows of the geothermal vents. Beside the maps, Ignis placed a sample of their stable crystal, its core pulsing with a gentle, unwavering light. He did not speak with words, but let a low, resonant hum fill the chamber, a psychic projection of the harmony they had achieved, of warm human longhouses and thriving drake sanctuaries. The elven lords watched, their expressions unreadable, but the air itself seemed to shift from detached curiosity to focused interest. The elves valued wisdom and stability above all else, and here was a tangible, working model of both, forged not by a single ancient race, but by two. Yet, the first question from a lord with silver hair and sharp, discerning eyes cut to the heart of their deepest vulnerability. "Your maps are elegant, and your energy source is impressive," he conceded, his voice like the whisper of wind through leaves. "But your pact is between races of such differing lifespans. Can a bond between a people who see centuries pass as seasons and those who live but a handful of decades truly possess the permanence required for lasting stability? Is this not a flower that will bloom brightly, only to wither when the next generation forgets the winter that forged it?" The doubt was not born of malice, but of a perspective so vast it struggled to comprehend the urgency of mortal lives. Elara met his gaze, her voice clear and steady despite the monumental setting. She did not argue for their alliance's eternal nature, but for its resilience. "Its strength is not in its duration, but in its depth," she replied. "We have not built a monument to a single handshake, but systems that make cooperation indispensable. Our children learn a shared history in new guilds. Our survival, our warmth, our prosperity are now woven from the same thread. A system where every family has a warm home because of a drake's knowledge is a system that will fight to preserve itself, regardless of who sits on the council. It is not a fleeting friendship, but a new foundation for society, and foundations outlive the builders." She was arguing that their shared purpose, codified into law and woven into daily life, created a permanence that mere individual lives could not. The stakes of this argument could not be higher. Gaining the Elven King's formal recognition would transform their northern alliance from a local curiosity into a legitimate political entity in the eyes of all the southern kingdoms. It would be a shield against any human lord or dwarf chieftain who might look at their unified lands and growing power with envious or fearful eyes. The silence in the throne room stretched thick and heavy. The High King's gaze moved from Elara's determined face to Ignisa's patient, powerful presence, and finally to the glowing crystal that represented their shared future. After what felt like an age, he spoke, his words measured and resonant. "We see the truth you have forged in ice and fire," he declared. "We offer not merely our recognition, but our hand. Let us form a tripartite council of elves, humans, and drakes to steward these lands and share wisdom for the challenges yet to come." The proposal was more than they had dared to hope for, a seat at a table of elders, but it also bound their fledgling alliance to the intricate and ancient politics of a race that measured time in millennia. The first council of three peoples convened not in a palace, but in a sun-dappled glade at the edge of the wilder wood, a place where no single race held dominion. The air, thick with the scent of pine and elven blossom, hummed with a tension that was both hopeful and profound. Here, the ancient, patient cadence of the elves met the urgent, practical rhythm of humanity, all observed by the deep, resonant presence of the drakes. Establishing the first protocols was like weaving three different languages into a single song. An elven lord might propose a century-long trial for a new trade route, while a human representative stressed the need for grain deliveries before the next winter. The drakes, whose territorial instincts were mapped in geothermal flows and mineral beds, struggled to translate their needs into the language of human commerce and elven diplomacy. Each clause, from the mutual defense pact to the rules of knowledge exchange, was a delicate negotiation, a constant reminder that trust on a handshake was one thing, but codifying it for generations was another. In the midst of this, Elara watched the debates ebb and flow, and she saw a solution rooted in their greatest success. She stood and proposed that the newly formed council adopt the joint Cartographers Guild as its primary arm for territorial oversight. Let the guild's mixed teams of human surveyors and drake scouts be the ones to map new borders, to assess resource claims, and to provide the unbiased geographical facts upon which all other agreements could be built. It was a masterstroke. The guild was a living example of their alliance in action, and its maps offered a neutral truth that transcended ancient grievances and differing lifespans. The elves, who revered wisdom and precision, saw the elegant logic in this. With this key body established, the final accord was sealed. The scattered villages of the northern wastes and the Drake's vast territories were, for the first time, formally recognized as a single, sovereign realm within Middle-earth, a tripartite protectorate governed by this unprecedented council. The potential was staggering, a model of cooperation that could bring stability and prosperity to the entire northern reach of the world, a beacon against the shadows of isolation and fear. As the final formalities concluded and the delegates began to disperse, Elara found a quiet moment alone. The weight of the parchment and the grandeur of the titles felt distant. Her thoughts drifted past the elegant spires and the murmuring trees, northward, across the rivers and over the jagged peaks, to the wind-scoured valleys and the silent, waiting stone of the monument they had built. Her work here had redefined a map, but it was the map of her own heart that now called her home. The cheers that greeted them in the northern wastes were a living, breathing thing, a roar of human voices, harmonizing with the resonant hum of drakes that shook the very air. The land they returned to was no longer a silent, forbidden expanse, but a hive of shared purpose. Scaffolding made of both timber and shaped crystal clung to new structures, and the paths were bustling with a mingled crowd of humans and drakes, working side by side. Elara, who had once slipped away in the dead of night as an outcast, now walked back as a founding leader, her hand resting on Ignis' scaled shoulder. In the great hall of the Cartographers Guild, the centerpiece was no longer a new map, but an old one, her original ink-stained vellum, now preserved under glass. It was a relic, a testament to the single, defiant step that had redrawn the world. Her days were no longer filled with the solitary crunch of gravel under her boots, but with the complex demands of a growing nation. The only true conflict that remained was the subtle, constant battle against their own success. With new settlers arriving daily, drawn by tales of warmth and wonder, there was a risk that the profound principles of the Pact, the shared stewardship, the mutual respect, could be diluted into mere convenience. It was a quieter struggle than facing down armed hunters or a volatile mountain, but in many ways it was more perilous. The peace could be lost not in a fiery cataclysm, but in a slow, comfortable forgetting. So Elara made a deliberate choice. She delegated the day-to-day governance to a new generation of human and Drake administrators she had trained herself, choosing to step back from the council chambers and into the role of a mentor. Her true work now was to plant the seeds of curiosity in the next generation of explorers, to ensure the spirit of discovery that had built their world would also be its guardian. The personal stakes had transformed completely. It was no longer about proving a truth or saving herself, but about weaving her legacy so deeply into the fabric of their society that it would endure long after her own short life was over. In the quiet hours, she often walked alone to the great stone monument in the valley. Her fingers would trace the carved lines that told their story, her eyes seeing not the finished pillar, but the memory of a young woman with ink-stained fingers taking that first, terrified step into the unknown. The map had been completed, the alliance secured, but the journey of understanding, she knew, was a path that never truly ended. The peace of the northern wastes was measured in generations, not just seasons. It was a rhythm of shared harvests and crystalline hums, a world so stable that the old fears felt like stories told to frighten children. But the deepest mountains hold the oldest memories, and a shadow stirred in the forgotten east, a relic from a time before pacts or councils. They called it Vorath, a worm of a dead and terrible age. It was not a thinking being, not a person like Ignis or his kin, but a creature of pure, insatiable hunger, a void of malice that fed on raw power. It felt the great, thrumming energy of the stabilized geothermal network like a beacon, a feast it had been dreaming of for 1,000 years. When its vast, leathery wings first blotted out the sun, the very air grew cold and heavy with a dread that had no place in this new world. This was not an enemy you could reason with or map. It was a storm of teeth and rage, and its only goal was to crack the world open and drink its heart. The call to arms was not a shout, but a resonance that traveled through the Tripartite councils, linked crystals. From the elegant spires of the elven south came a contingent of silver-armored archers and mages who understood that this blight threatened the continent's balance. From the human villages came every able-bodied man and woman, not with the old fear in their eyes, but with a fierce, protective determination. And from the high roosts came the full might of the drakes, led by Ignis, whose scales now bore the soft patina of age, but whose eyes held the fire of 100 shared winters. They gathered not as 3 separate armies, but as a single, woven force. Their strategy was not to meet Vorath's brute strength with their own. A direct confrontation would have been a slaughter. Instead, they would use the land itself, the very land they had learned to understand together, as their weapon. The plan was a masterpiece of their hard-won unity, a final exam for their alliance. Elara, her own hair now streaked with silver, stood beside Ignis and the elven commander, moving tokens across a map that was a product of all their knowledge. They would not fight the worm, they would invite it in. Using the Cartographers Guild's most detailed surveys, they identified the most powerful and unstable geothermal vent in the territory, the one they had named the World's Forge. Their mixed teams worked in a frantic, precise ballet. Human engineers and dwarf sappers, under the guidance of Drake artisans, carefully weakened the natural stone ducts surrounding the vent, creating a geological snare. Elven mages wove illusions of concentrated power above it, a shimmering, irresistible lure for the power-mad beast. The drakes, in coordinated flights, would harry and herd Vorath, using their knowledge of thermal currents to guide the monster toward the trap, never engaging directly, always feinting and withdrawing. It was a strategy that required absolute trust. A single human crew failing to trigger a rock slide, one drake breaking formation in panic, one elven spell faltering, and the entire plan would collapse into chaos. When Vorath descended upon the world's forge, the mountain shook. The air itself screamed as the worm tore at the illusions, its massive claws digging into the rock as it sought to burrow down to the source of the energy. This was the moment. From a high ledge, Elara gave the signal, a coordinated strike from elven arrows, precisely aimed by human spotters, severed the critical ropes, holding a series of counterweights. With a groan that sounded like the world itself taking a breath, the weakened rim of the vent collapsed inward. Vorath, consumed by its greed, was caught in the sudden landslide, its vast form plunging into the fissure. But it was not defeated. It thrashed, its raw power straining against the mountain, threatening to shatter the trap and escape. This was the final, critical step. Ignis, with a look to Elara that held a lifetime of understanding, led the full chorus of drakes. They did not breathe fire upon the beast. Instead, they focused their collective will, their ancient connection to the earth's energy, into a single, resonant harmonic. They sang to the mountain, a deep, stabilizing hum that amplified the natural energy flows, calming the vent's volatility and turning the chaotic power into a focused, contained field. The very energy Vorath sought to consume became its prison, a searing, inescapable cage of pure light. The worm's roars of fury turned to shrieks of futile rage, and then to silence as the mountain sealed itself around it. The victory was not met with cheers, but with a profound, weary silence. They had not slain a monster. They had solved a problem, the ultimate expression of their shared philosophy. They had defended their home not with the sword, but with the map, the chisel, and the song. In that moment, under a sky clearing of its shadow, the Alliance was no longer a political entity or a hopeful experiment. It was the true, unshakable ruler of the northern wastes, the power that had forged this land and would protect it for all the ages to come, was not found in the tooth of a worm or the fire of a drake, but in the invisible, unbreakable threads of trust woven between them. The northern wastes now thrive as a living testament to what different peoples can build when they choose to listen. The old tales of when dragons ruled are no longer warnings whispered in fear around a dying fire. They are the foundation stories told to children in the new guild halls, a shared history that belongs to everyone. Elara, her hair silvered by the passing years, but her spirit as bright as the day she crossed the boundary stone, stands on a high perch. Beside her, Ignis rests, his massive form a familiar and comforting presence, his deep, slow breaths a rhythm as constant as the mountain itself. Together, they look out upon the vibrant lands below, where the lights of human settlements twinkle beside the soft, pulsating glow of drake sanctuaries in the deepening twilight. The air is filled with the distant, harmonious sounds of a civilization that should not exist, yet does. Her original map, the one she risked everything to create, hangs preserved in the great hall. She knows now it was only the first line, the opening sentence of a story so much greater than one person's quest. It was the spark. The generations that followed have written the chapters, building a world where a miner from Stonehand and a crystal weaver from the high spires can solve a problem together without a second thought, where an elven diplomat and a young drake scholar can debate philosophy under the stars. The true power was never in the land itself, nor in the strength of any single people. It was always in the choice to see a partner where your ancestors saw only a monster, to extend a hand instead of raising a weapon. The story of the northern wastes is still being written, its borders forever expanding, not on parchment, but in the daily acts of trust that weave the future ever tighter. And as the twin moons rise over the peaceful valleys, that future feels as limitless as the star-strewn sky above. you.